Good afternoon and welcome to our May Dementia Dialogue entitled, I Have Never Had a Ticket in My Life, How to Handle Driving. In 2017, we're taking a look at a variety of situations and sentiments that impact caregivers generally of people with dementia. And driving tends to be, well, sometimes it can be an easy issue to deal with, other times it can be a real challenge. So we're really looking forward to hearing Dr. Burke's presentation today. Before we begin, though, a bit of housekeeping to go over. Of note, you will have opportunity to submit text questions today to the presenter by typing your questions into the question pane on the control panel. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and then address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If any of you are joining us exclusively by phone, we're going to be unable to accept questions today, but please do reach out to us with the contact information provided at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded and will be posted to our website for future reference within 48 hours of the end of today's presentation. Also, please note that our handouts, if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, are in the handout pane of the control panel. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Anna Burke. Dr. Burke is a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist currently working as a dementia specialist in the Stead Family Memory Clinic at the Banner Alzheimer's Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. She has worked extensively with patients and families suffering with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Her area of expertise includes diagnosis and treatment of dementia, as well as treatment of associated behavioral and psychiatric disturbances. Dr. Burke is also involved in clinical research of new pharmacotherapies, neuromodulation, environmental modifications, prevention methods, and neuroimaging techniques. She completed her medical training at Gdansk Medical University in Gdansk, Poland. She went on to complete an internship in internal medicine at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. Dr. Burke completed her adult psychiatric residency training at the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, before completing a geriatric psychiatry fellowship at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, the nation's foremost psychiatric institution and the main teaching hospital for the Harvard Medical School. She is an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. She's currently the primary investigator leading a groundbreaking neuromodulation study at Banner Alzheimer's Institute involving the implantation of a deep brain stimulator for treatment of cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's dementia. Please help me welcome Dr. Burke.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Anna Burke, and I am glad to be with you today leading this very important topic. As many of you know, cognitive impairment, as it progresses, will lead to different functional impairments over time. Most of us expect that there will be losses over the course of this illness. That means more and more losses in our independence, more and more challenges over time. One of the most challenging losses is the loss of ability to drive. For many of us, our childhood was spent eagerly awaiting, anticipating our driver's licenses. It was a rite of passage with which came independence, autonomy. The loss of this ability bears with it a great deal of meaning for most of us. It can be extremely difficult for even the most responsible individual to make the decision to stop driving. Discussions related to driving are also some of the most difficult for families to engage in. So during today's presentation, we will review some of the brain changes that occur in dementia and how they can affect driving abilities. We'll also discuss some of the signs indicating that driving may be an issue, and we will discuss strategies to address problems with driving and what to do when driving needs to stop. So let's start by talking about the difficulties in dementia in terms of driving. Well, driving is an extremely complex task which engages nearly all regions of your brain. As dementia attacks the brain, the areas that are necessary for safe driving can over time become injured. They can begin to deteriorate. What's more is the connections between different regions of the brain that are necessary for driving can also start to become impaired. Imagine that sometimes the connections between the regions of the brain that are involved in planning and organization of information can become disengaged from regions that affect or that are involved in visual processing of information. So for instance, a person may see something that's happening on the road, but their brain may not be able to formulate a plan to respond to it correctly. Since Alzheimer's, dementia, and other types of dementias are generally progressive illnesses, we expect that all people suffering from dementia will eventually become unsafe to drive. That means that planning for this eventuality is important for everyone with this diagnosis, no matter how mild their symptoms may be at a particular time. Let's take a look at some of the changes that occur in thinking and function in dementia. Well, as we all know, memory is affected, particularly in Alzheimer's disease. In fact, initially, Alzheimer's tends to affect short-term memory. What this means is that people may have a harder time storing new information. They may have more difficulty recalling directions, finding their way around. Recognizing street signs can become an issue over time. Many people with time will have difficulty also recalling past events and experiences, which may affect their judgment on the road. They may not be able to remember or use the information from previous experiences. Language abilities can start to become affected. So the ability to recall words, to understand over time, written language can also start to change. This may make it more difficult for people to read and understand street signs and directions. Visual spatial abilities can also start to become affected. What that means is how the brain processes what the eyes are seeing begins to change. So judging distances and horizons, as well as changes in the environment, can become more difficult. People may have a greater tendency towards tailgating or not keeping appropriate distances. Or you may notice that they start keeping excessive distances, and that can lead to all kinds of other problems, including frustration from other drivers that may then engage in more aggressive and dangerous behavior. Coordination, the ability to multitask and coordinate complex tasks, can become affected over the course of a dementia. Most people can find it more overwhelming to be required to do more than one thing at once. And if you think about driving, it really does require a divided attention, an ability to coordinate multiple tasks at once. Imagine how many things you have to keep track of while you're on the road. Changing traffic lights, pedestrians that may jot into the road, other drivers on the road that may not necessarily be paying attention, maybe texting or eating or are about to change lanes. So organizing and prioritizing this information becomes more difficult in dementia. That means that individuals suffering from this disease may have a harder time responding to emergencies. They may be more prone to accidents that may not even be their fault. It's just a matter of how their brain is perceiving their environment and how quickly it is able to process information. Judgment and insight are also required in order to respond to changing conditions on the road. Being able to analyze options and anticipate scenarios is vital to driving. This impairment in judgment and insight, as well as the inability to remember previous experiences, can all adversely affect a person's ability to respond to emergencies and changing conditions on the road. And lastly, as many families will frequently notice, their loved one's personality or behaviors can start to change. So emotional responses to common events or stressors on the road can start to change with dementia. Some individuals may be more prone to fits of anger or even road rage. Others may become more anxious or more easily overwhelmed while on the road. So how do we know if a person's abilities are impaired or if driving needs to be assessed? Well, unfortunately for some families, that happens when an accident occurs. But the reality is that oftentimes signs that driving may be an issue become apparent even before a crisis happens. Some of the things that indicate that there might be a problem include a person beginning to modify or limit their driving. So for instance, if your loved one starts to drive only in familiar places, or stops driving at night, or really wants to have somebody else in the car as they're driving, that may indicate that they might be struggling with that task. Requiring a co-pilot to navigate. I can't tell you how many times I hear this from families. He does well or she does well as long as I'm in the car. In fact, I've had families or patients whose loved ones required very detailed instructions on how to drive. So when to stop, what to do at a red light or a left turn. And in fact got into accidents because a loved one who was the co-pilot looked down for a moment and didn't notice the stop sign or the stoplight. Avoiding highways or busy streets. That type of avoidance may indicate that that multitasking ability is becoming impaired. That processing of a lot of information coming at that person at once may be more difficult. You might also notice that your loved one is becoming more anxious or angry on the road, more easily overwhelmed. Trips to destinations may take longer than expected. That may indicate that the person may be getting lost along the way. Unexplained dings or scratches on the car. Perhaps your loved one is getting into accidents. Or again, that processing of visual information and distances is becoming affected, leading to small dings and scratches. Traffic citations, if there are more parking tickets or any kind of uncharacteristic behaviors, driving may be an issue. And then increased hesitation and decreased speed while driving. A lot of families think that this is actually a good thing. Mom or dad are driving slowly. But driving slowly does not necessarily indicate that a person is driving safely. They may be driving slowly or excessively slowly because they're having a very difficult time processing everything that's around them. If you feel uncomfortable driving with them, that's a strong indicator that an assessment may be necessary. Again, I can't tell you how many times I hear from families, I wouldn't drive with them, or I wouldn't let my children drive with them. But when you think about it, if you continue to allow your loved one to be on the road, you're endangering other people's children and pedestrians and other people who are on the road. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, that's a very strong indicator that something may be wrong, and trust your gut. Here are some other common warning signs to pay attention to. You can look for these lists online or through your insurance company. These are typical driving behavior warning signs, some of which we have talked about previously. It's a good idea to have a list like this And at the time that concerns arise, note how often they're occurring, what the situations that they're occurring in are. This will make it easier for you to discuss some of your concerns with your loved one's physician. Another common question that I receive from families is, how does the doctor know when it's time to stop driving? Well, the reality is that we rely quite a bit on your reports. There are several factors that play a key role. I mean, obviously we do cognitive testing, we do neurological examinations. All of those can give us some information regarding potential problems that may arise. But what we're seeing in the office is essentially a snapshot. What you're seeing at home is what I like to call the full film. So you're seeing the day-to-day, you're seeing the frustrations, you're seeing the potential problems, the errors that tests may not necessarily pick up in a brief interaction. So we rely very heavily on the family report. We look for any changes in driving habits that you might be observing. We also ask about some of the functional changes that you're observing in day-to-day life. Remember that these functional changes may translate to problems on the road. So if your loved one is having problems with other tasks that require multitasking, such as management of the finances, management of medications, cooking, which requires a lot of multitasking, or management of household chores, that may indicate that driving is going to be an issue. Your doctor may also perform a neurological and physical examination. Now, these neurological and physical examinations can determine if there are some physical limitations that may be contributing or may make it more difficult for them to operate a motor vehicle. Things that we look for typically are changes in range of motion, Parkinsonian symptoms, vision problems, hearing problems. All of this can make it more difficult to respond to emergencies on the road. Finally, your doctors will take a look at the cognitive testing. Now, as a dementia specialist, I typically will do brief in-office screening tests on a regular basis, at least once a year, to determine where problems may arise. These cognitive tests can actually tell us quite a bit about what types of problems may be down the road. And I'd like to show you what one of these tests may look like. This is actually something called a MoCA, or Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test. It's a test that takes about 10 minutes to administer. The test typically tells us how things are progressing. So it does test a person's memory. We give the individual 5 words to remember, ask them to repeat those words back to us after just being exposed to them, and then after a delay or a distraction. But we also take a look at how that person's brain is processing visual information, how it is multitasking, what the attentional abilities also look like. So if you look at the top portion of the test that says visual, spatial, and executive, that portion of the test actually tells us how good a person is at multitasking. The first part of the test is something we call the Trails B. So here we ask an individual to connect numbers and letters in an ascending order. 1A, 2B, 3C, 4D, 5E, until they reach the end. That forces their brain to multitask. They have to hold on to several pieces of information at once, put together a plan, and then carry out that plan. That becomes more difficult over time as a dementia progresses. Same thing with the cube drawing that you see right next to this. If you think about it, you really need a good connection between the eyes and the brain. The brain has to process visual information correctly in order to be able to perform this task. You also have to be able to plan and organize this task, so that executive function has to be intact. And here you can see that this individual had difficulty with both these tasks, and he was actually still on the road. Same thing with the clock drawing that you see in the corner. We ask a person to draw a clock, put the numbers on the clock, which takes a lot of planning and organization, and then put the hands at 10 past 11. So again, planning, organization, executive function. If we see impairments in this part of the test, there's a pretty good chance that processing the multiple things that come at you on the road will become more difficult. Not just because of the planning inability, but also because of the way that the brain is processing visual information. So these tests can be very helpful, and asking your doctor to show you what this part of the test looks like may be vital in helping you understand where issues may arise. Now, if your loved one has been diagnosed with dementia, it is important to closely observe their driving. I actually recommend that most family members drive with their loved one once every 2 weeks, at the very least once every month. And observe them. Observe them not just on the straight and narrow, but in different situations, in different conditions. So most people actually do pretty well as long as they're driving on the straight and narrow road in a familiar environment. Unfortunately, that's not the reality of where we do most of our driving. Most people need to drive to the grocery store. They may need to drive to the hairdresser, to church. Those are situations where you're going to be in parking lots. You're going to be in crowded areas. And those are situations where your brain will be required to have divided attention. So imagine in the grocery parking lot, you're in your car, you're trying to figure out what to do as far as backing out of your parking space. There may be people walking around, children running around, people not paying attention, other cars pulling out. That becomes a recipe for disaster. So observe your loved ones not just on the straight and narrow road, but in busy parking lots, on highways. See how they're doing. Are they getting flustered? Are they making more errors? Are there near misses? If concerns arise regarding your loved one's driving, do a formal driving evaluation. These are available through the motor vehicle department or through private agencies. And we actually recommend that you do these on a yearly basis. These professional assessments can actually identify problems so that you can make a decision as to whether you would like to continue driving or whether it's time to step back. But also, let's say if your loved one is found to be safe on the road. Having done this type of assessment may reduce your liability in case of an accident. Essentially, it shows that they are a responsible driver and know that they have a medical condition for which they have done everything to maintain safety on the road. Doing this on an annual basis can be helpful in reducing legal liability should something happen. Keep in mind that there is no single right way to address this difficult issue of driving with your loved one. No two families are alike. Family relationships and individual personalities vary and will affect your approach. What works for one person in terms of discussion may not work for another. But early planning is is key. So as I mentioned earlier, dementia is a progressive illness. Over time, all individuals suffering from dementia will become unsafe to drive. It's best to start planning early before driving becomes an issue. In the early stages, involving your loved one in the planning process can actually be very helpful. You can set up an agreement with my family about driving. That agreement can define who they trust to tell them when it's time to stop driving. They can arrange regular driving monitoring visits where family members will drive with that person to observe his or her driving. I typically recommend, again, that these occur at least once every 2 weeks, or if that's more difficult, at least once a month, so that you're able to catch any problems as they arise and before they turn into tragedies. Preventative monitoring on a yearly basis may be something to discuss during this early planning session. So your loved one may want to protect their assets. They may want to protect their family members. And in the early stages, they may be more amenable to undergoing these driving evaluations. Once they become a habit, it will be much easier to continue them and to avoid problems in the future. Now, let's talk about some of the non-confrontational approaches to reduce the need for driving. You should attempt to create ways to make driving less appealing and unnecessary. Knowing that there are going to be problems in the future, you really want to minimize the driving even early on as much as possible. So for example, anticipate your loved one's needs. This may be helpful in reducing the need for driving. Consider having groceries and meals or prescriptions delivered to the home. If possible, arrange for a barber or a hairdresser to make home visits. Invite friends and family members over for regular visits. This may reduce your loved one's need to drive and to visit them. Invite friends and family to offer transportation. Consider a move to a more supportive environment that offers transportation. Assisted living communities frequently will offer this type of service. They may also offer on-site amenities, including various activities, hairdressers, restaurants, and other services that may reduce the need to leave that community. Sometimes appealing to your loved one's sense of financial responsibility may help reduce the need for driving. So build a case for elimination of the car for financial reasons. Automobile insurance, it's important to note, will frequently be more expensive for individuals that carry a diagnosis of a neurological condition such as dementia. In many states, driving with a medical condition such as dementia is also treated as though the person is driving impaired. So it's no different in terms of insurance or liability than driving under the influence of alcohol or narcotics. In these instances, if an accident occurs, insurance companies can choose not to cover the cost of the accident, which leaves your loved one and your family with significant costs. Family and power of attorneys can frequently also be held legally responsible if they knowingly allowed their loved one to drive with a medical condition. So essentially, you could be sued. Your whole family could be sued. Sometimes making the argument of protecting your assets or protecting the family from legal liability of driving with a medical condition can actually make the patient or the individual reconsider their driving. So when your loved one does need to stop driving, it becomes a very, very difficult discussion. Discussing your concerns regarding your loved one's driving is never going to be an easy conversation. In fact, this is going to be the most difficult conversation that most families have. It is best to explain the situation directly to your loved one and share your feelings of worry and concern. Sometimes that will work. During the discussion, be firm, be patient, demonstrate an understanding of how difficult this must be for them, empathize with them. This is a very difficult thing to hear and a very difficult decision for most anybody to make, especially somebody who's already dealing with a lot of the losses that this disease brings with it. Focus on the disease. Don't focus on the individual. Don't use statements like "you are" or "because of your" whatever personality traits or problems. Focus on the disease as you're discussing the issues. A discussion about driving can feel like a personal assault. So sometimes focusing on the disease that affects the brain, much like a stroke would, makes it a little bit less threatening for your loved one. Imagine if they had had a stroke or if they had epilepsy or another neurological or medical condition. This probably wouldn't be as difficult a decision to make. But somehow, having that diagnosis of dementia is far more painful and feels like far more of a personal attack. Appeal to your loved one's sense of responsibility. So as we discussed previously, many individuals may not want to jeopardize the well-being of their family, including the financial security of their spouses or their children. Use this to your advantage. And ask a respected family authority figure or your family attorney to reinforce the message about not driving. If the conversation doesn't go well, don't blame yourself. The disease can impair insight and judgment, and it can make it difficult for people to understand that their driving is no longer safe. Also, the disease can cause mood and personality changes that make emotional reactions more pronounced. Don't take this personally. Also, don't become the bad guy. So if the conversation is not going well, stop. Discuss your concerns with your loved one's doctor and allow the doctor to become the bad guy. We're used to it. You can always change doctors. You can always go to another physician. So let the doctor take the blame and focus on being there for your loved one, being there to support them. Make statements like, "Mom, I can't believe this happened, but don't worry, we will figure a way out of this. We will support you any step we can, any way we can. We'll figure out ways that you can still live a full life and get around." So you're there to support them. We, as the physicians, can be the bad guys. Remember that you're dealing with a memory problem. So your loved one may not remember that they're not supposed to drive. Get a prescription from the doctor indicating that driving has to stop. That prescription is a tool and an excuse in case your loved one becomes frustrated about why you're not allowing them to drive. Again, present that to them if they insist they need to drive. Blame it on the doctor and tell them, you know what, this is what needs to happen right now. We'll talk about it the next time we're at the doctor's office. That gives you a little bit of a deferral and a little bit of time. And then keep in mind that therapeutic fibbing can also be very helpful. So if your loved one continues to insist that they need to drive, therapeutic fibbing may be necessary. When a person becomes confused or disabled, drastic steps may need to be taken. Consider hiding keys or telling your loved one that they're lost. Sometimes filing down a key, or for our newer cars, taking out the battery from the key so that the car doesn't start may be an option. Replacing keys with dummy keys that don't start the car may also be helpful. Disabling the car, so removing the battery, is another option. And then lastly, one thing that I found works actually probably the best is removing the car altogether and telling the loved one that the car's in the shop, it's being repaired. And whenever your loved one asks about the car, it's still being repaired. Remember that there is a loss of sense of time. So whether you're repeating this once a week, once every other day, whether you've been repeating it for the past month, your loved one may not sense that passage of time. Finally, as you plan for the inevitable loss of driving, consider transportation alternatives that are available in most communities. So family members are a great resource. Friends are a great resource when your loved one cannot drive. Consider making a list with names, phone numbers, and times of availability of those who are willing to provide transportation. Public transportation may be an option for individuals, especially those in the early stages of dementia. Now, this works best when your loved one is already familiar with the public transportation system in the area. People in late stages of dementia really probably will not be able to figure out bus routes or schedules. So again, this is more for those who are familiar with the system and who are in the earlier stages of illness. For individuals who are in the early to middle stages of dementia and who don't have behavioral problems, taxis or ride-sharing services may be an option, especially the prepaid options like, for instance, Uber or Lyft. As long as somebody actually meets that individual on both ends of the taxi or ride-sharing service. And then in the yellow pages of many phone books, there's a special section in the front with names and addresses of various services and organizations for seniors and those with special needs. Look under transportation or community services for names of agencies that provide transportation for special needs, and consider using these. So I know probably quite a few of you have questions, have been personally affected by this, so I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burke, for this thorough overview of driving from a variety of different angles and a lot of really fantastic strategies to kind of help people deal with this challenging issue. I would invite our participants to enter any questions that they have for Dr. Burke in the questions pane, and we'll try to get to all of them. We do have one question that came in that's asking what stage should someone be in when they need to stop driving?
Well, that varies from person to person. Depending on how impaired that multitasking ability or that visual spatial ability is, it may be in the moderate stages, but it may be also in the mild stages of illness. There are certain types of dementias also that will affect visual spatial abilities far earlier. In fact, that's the first thing to go. Parkinson's dementias, Lewy body dementias are such diseases. So it's really individual. Some people, most people are still safe to drive in the very early stages. But as they start to enter more towards the moderate stage, that ability to drive starts to become affected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the formal driving evaluation being a good practice for people to start doing an annual assessment for a variety of different reasons. Do you know, what does that entail? What happens at a formal driving evaluation?
Well, driving evaluations vary. So depending on where you go, they may be more or less intense. There are rehab programs, for instance, in many major hospitals that will do very, very thorough evaluations. So typically those evaluations will start with a pen and paper test, similar to what you saw, what I presented, that will assess where some of the areas of weakness as far as thinking and visual processing may be. After that, there are typically on-road tests where the individual will drive with an observer in different situations and kind of be assessed based on how they respond to different situations.
Okay, and then does the formal driving evaluation, do they have the ability to stop someone from driving? I know you had mentioned that it can be a good resource to prevent liability issues, but does it also work the other way?
So it can, and this will vary depending on the state and depending on local laws. But in most cases, if there are concerns that are raised, a report will be sent to the person's physician. I can tell you in our clinic, we typically will have a discussion with family or with the patient regarding the concerns that were raised in the driving evaluation. In some states, however, the evaluator will actually be legally obligated to send a report to the Department of Motor Vehicles regarding the concerns.
Okay, very interesting. So important to do research in the specific state that you live in. Yeah. Along those lines too, do you know, once someone receives a diagnosis of dementia, are they required to alert insurance companies to that?
I don't know that they're obligated to do so. And again, I would expect that this would vary depending on the state. For instance, states like California have very strict laws regarding driving with dementia. Driving with dementia essentially needs to stop. So once that diagnosis is made, the driver's license, if you will, would likely be suspended. As far as insurance companies, if an accident occurs, if there are any concerns about your cognitive function, your well-being, they can subpoena medical records and based on that can refuse to cover the accident.
Okay, I see. You also mentioned quite a bit through your presentation about really partnering with your medical provider. What do you recommend a family does if they are concerned about someone's driving ability but having a difficult time getting their provider on board with that issue?
Well, you might need to look at a different provider. Have that discussion with your loved one's physician. If they don't listen, if they're not willing to address this with your loved one, then perhaps going to the Department of Motor Vehicles and making an anonymous report may actually be another option. So in many states, you can actually request that a driving evaluation be done. It doesn't necessarily have to go through your physician. And your loved one doesn't have to know who made that request or raised that concern.
Okay. And now we have kind of some situational questions that have come in. It looks like we have a participant who is a concerned party, but not family, not a friend, maybe more of a neighbor type relationship of someone who lives alone, and they've become concerned about their neighbors driving, but don't have that sort of close relationship to address that discussion with them. Do you have any advice on next steps that the concerned neighbor could take?
Well, again, there's always the option of making concerns known through the Department of Motor Vehicles if you feel that that neighbor is perhaps a danger to themselves, a danger to other neighbors, children in the neighborhood, etc. It's always best, though, to raise some of the concerns with perhaps family members, children, or sometimes being there for your neighbor if you're able to build a closer relationship with them, and then perhaps helping them to get to a doctor's appointment, discussing some of the concerns with the physician might be an option. It's really a difficult situation when you don't have a close relationship with that individual. Keep in mind, reasoning, judgment, insight, all of that starts to become impaired in dementia. So you may not be able to reason with them if you don't have a close relationship with that person.
Great point, and I applaud our participants for joining in, being concerned about someone that they maybe not are very close with. You mentioned a strategy in your presentation to maybe, for the person with dementia who's a little reluctant, we tried the non-confrontational ways and having conversations. You mentioned a concept of therapeutic fibbing in your presentation and gave a lot of examples about how to implement that technique. How do you respond to people who really resist therapeutic fibbing with their person? I think we've all encountered the individual who says, well, I've never lied to my mother before. I've never lied to my spouse before. I'm not going to start now.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that person?
I wouldn't think of it as lying. So one of the things that happens in dementia is that people tend to process the world differently. We tend to become more childlike in the way that we interact with the world. Not childish, but childlike. So how you reason, what your judgment looks like becomes childlike. It's more like a toddler or a school-age child. Now, you wouldn't reason in certain situations with your 5-year-old, right? You would probably just explain things in a manner that would be appropriate for that age. Or you may just make things happen and just not get into certain situations or conversations. You should be thinking about how your loved one's brain is processing the world right now, trying to reason with them, expecting them to cognitively be able to process information and arguments in the same manner that they did before this illness started to ravage their brain is not appropriate. So you have to take steps to reduce some of their frustration, to reduce some of your own frustration and stress. And that may mean changing the way that you communicate. That may mean therapeutic fibbing. I wouldn't think of it as lying. I would think of it as simply reducing their frustration and focusing on minimizing their distress.
Great, thank you. I think that's a common issue that people have with that technique, and I really appreciate the clarification on what the intention is with using that. We do have another question. You mentioned at the end really assessing the resources that you have available, tapping into public transportation and Uber or taxi services. Do you have any strategies for our participants who are living in rural areas and may not have access to those sorts of transportation?
Well, I think in those situations, family and friends really become vital. Also, again, anticipating some of the needs that may arise. Thank goodness we now have certain services that will deliver everything from groceries to toiletries to anything that you need directly to your home, prescription services. So there are ways that you can minimize the need to drive. And then taking advantage of family as much as possible may be an option there.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic advice. It's amazing what you can have delivered no matter where you live these days. Well, I think that brings us to the end of all of the questions that our participants have sent in. If anybody thinks of further issues or clarification for Dr. Burke, please feel free to send that information in to us and we can respond to it accordingly. I do want to thank Dr. Burke for taking the time to share her extensive expertise in this topic and again, taking such a thorough approach to us and helping us to really understand the complex process of driving and also the impairment that our person can be experiencing because of it and giving us such fantastic solutions and strategies to help deal with this issue. I'll remind our participants that the webinar is being recorded today and it will be posted on our website within 48 hours. As soon as we close the discussion today, you will receive an evaluation from us. Please do take a few moments to fill that out. Let us know what you thought of the presentation and if there's any future topics that you would like to have discussed, because we do create these for you as a caregiver. I would like to invite you to join us next month on June 21st as we look at another situation or sentiment related to dementia caregiving, where we're looking at the role of genetics. And if my mother had this disease or my father had this disease, does that mean that I'm going to get Alzheimer's disease too? You can register for that on our website as well. I want to thank you for joining Dementia Dialogues this afternoon, where we bring the dementia education to you.